Hello, this video is about the potential US-Iran deal, which, if it happens, will be the most important development in the politics of the Grand Middle East in the foreseeable future. Now, the important point to start with is that the potential deal between the US and Iran is vastly different from the one that was signed 5 years ago. Then, it was a limited deal primarily to postpone the Iranian nuclear program. Now, a potential deal is about the security arrangements in the Gulf and the Eastern Mediterranean, so much bigger in scope and importance. There are 5 reasons that bode well for an agreement between the US and Iran. 1. The US realizes that it has already entered into a big strategic confrontation with China. And in that confrontation, the US wants to assert its influence, its supremacy over a number of regions in the world for that big chessboard game with China that is to come. The Gulf is one of these regions. And the Eastern Mediterranean is an extension of the Gulf in many ways, and also importantly linked to the transfer of energy and many other factors. Iran has been the most successful country strategically in that part of the world in the past 10-15 years. Iran managed to have a very influential and often decisively influential presence in a number of countries in the region. Iran has now a very assertive, powerful, sizable presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's no longer just a Gulf player, it is also a Levantine player. And Iran has also managed to have some sort of a balance of deterrence with Israel. All of these factors together mean that if the United States wants to assert its power, its supremacy, in the big region that is the Gulf and the Eastern Mediterranean, there is a case for having or reaching a deal with Iran. The second reason is linked more or less to the first reason. Because Iran has managed to have all of these successes, there is a view that actually the deal between the United States and Iran could lead some of the functions that Iran has managed to secure in a number of countries in this part of the world to become conducive to American interests in that region. Again, from the American perspective, not just to pacify, to control the region, but in the wider sense of the US-China confrontation. The third reason is that Iran also wants a deal with the United States because of tactical short-term reasons as well as strategic long-term reasons. In the short term, Iran has suffered from the economic sanctions that the Trump administration imposed on it. Suffered economically, suffered socially, and suffered in its ability to support its proxies and allies in the region. Somebody will say, well, but Iran has weathered these sanctions. True, but at a very high cost. And therefore, a deal with the US would entail, in the Iranian thinking, lifting the US sanctions and therefore lowering the cost for Iran of maintaining its presence. The strategic long-term reasons why Iran wants a deal with the US is that Iran knows that only the United States can strip it away from the gains, from the successes it has secured in a number of countries in the past 10 or 15 years. And therefore, Iran wants a deal with the US so that it can secure these interests at a lower, much lower cost. Here it's important to note that there are many players inside Iran, and not only in the foreign service, which traditionally is Western oriented, but actually voices inside Iran in other spheres of power in Tehran that do believe that Iranian presence in a number of countries in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Levant, does not fly in the face of American interests in that part of the world. So in their view, there is a room for a deal with the US. The final reason for a deal, simply chemistry. In politics, as in anything else in life, personal chemistry is very important. And there is prior acquaintance and actually good rapport between a number of important figures in the Biden administration and policymakers in Iran. And therefore, there's this element of, from an American point of view, we can do business with the Iranian team on the other side. In Iran, there's an important point also, which is they do know that a number of those figures in the Biden administration look at the Middle East with this historical, civilizational viewpoint, which is very important for Iran, because Iran has always craved respect, not from its neighbors, but from the West, and primarily from the United States. So to have a team in the US that looks historically at the region and has an admiration for the Persian civilization is also chemistry-wise a very positive point. And this mutual positiveness between the two teams will certainly help in potentially having a deal. And yet, there are 5 reasons that are against a potential deal between the US and Iran. The first one of them is a clash of mindsets. The US continues to look at the Middle East through imperial eyes, and often the US behaves in the region as an empire. On the other side, Iran sees its own achievements in the last 10-15 years and thinks that these successes gives it some right to reciprocity with the United States. Now, some people might say, oh, that's a simple point. It is not. This clash of mindsets often, and we have seen it many times in history, can ruin any serious negotiations. The second point is a bit strategic. The United States realizes and acknowledges actually the successes of Iran over the last 10 or 15 years. And yet, the United States most likely will not accept that Iran continues to have a presence in the Eastern Mediterranean that is deemed a threat to Israel. On the other hand, for Iran, the ability that it can, through its allies and proxies, to threaten Israel and the implied balance of deterrence with Israel is arguably one of the most important and prized achievements for Iran. So for Iran to let go of that prized achievement is a very heavy price to pay for a deal with the United States. The third reason against a potential deal is also strategic from Iran's perspective. And that is, Iran knows that what the US really wants from an agreement with it is to have new security arrangements in the Levant, in the wider Eastern Mediterranean, in the Gulf, that are favorable for the United States in its strategic confrontation with China. But on the other hand, Iran wants to have positive, good, economically advanced relationships with China. Iran wants to have good relationships with Russia. So for Iran to sign to a big deal with the US that results in strategically favorable conditions to America at the expense of potentially their future relationships with China and with Russia, that's a very difficult calculus to think about and very difficult road to navigate post potential deal. And therefore this complication makes, on the Iranian side, makes the Iranian calculus difficult and therefore is a factor against the deal. The fourth point against the deal is the nuclear element of it. 5 years ago, in 2015, 2016, Iran was willing to accept relatively smaller rewards and some sort of general guarantees from the United States in return for some postponements in its nuclear program. But today, after Iran's experience with the Trump administration, Iran certainly will ask for very serious guarantees and will most likely, if not certainly, ask for big rewards today for a deal with the US. Now, the Biden administration certainly will find it very difficult to sell internally to Congress and to the American media big guarantees and big rewards to Iran. And this will complicate the potentiality of a deal. The fifth factor against the potential deal is lobbying. In Washington, D.C., there are strong lobbyists that are working against this potential deal. Some people will say, well, the Biden administration is still very new, early months, and therefore it doesn't really care much about the power of the lobbies. Not true. Any administration, even the administration of a one-term president, behind it there is a political party, there are many interests, and therefore the administration is cognizant of the electoral cost of big deals. And therefore the lobbying in Washington, D.C. against the deal is a very important factor to bear in mind. So there are 5 factors for the deal and 5 factors against the deal. The important point now for observers of the Middle East and the Gulf is to think about these factors and the dynamics between them, because these dynamics will shape one of the most important developments in politics in this part of the world in the foreseeable future.